We spend our lives pressing our bodies against each other, trying to break the surface tension of our skins to unite in a single gleaming bead. Let us rehearse for that moment when our spirits finally trickle together.
So I talked about how psychedelics affect perception and emotions, but a lot of people bring up how psychedelics affect them spiritually. I think it's fair to be skeptical of this, but it's not like a recent hippy-dippy thing. It's been going on for thousands of years. There's a certain mushroom with psilocybin that grows in northern Africa. There are these murals there from 9,000 years ago that show dancers holding those mushrooms with rays like emanating at their heads. There are similar murals in Spain that are 6,000 years old. But then in the 1500s, Spanish imperialists were trying to stop the Aztecs from consuming what the Aztecs called God's flesh. Sort of like how the United States government tried to stop indigenous people from using peyote in religious ceremonies. When Alan Moore was writing Saga of the Swamp Thing in the 80s, there wasn't really much research into psychedelics, and that was because of the war on drugs. President Nixon's domestic policy advisor later came out and said that the whole war on drugs was a pretext to arrest hippies and black people. I brought receipts, citations in the description. Finally, only in the past decade, scientists were able to renew this investigation into this connection between psychedelics and spiritual feelings. One of the first things they found was that their test subjects loved it. There was a 2008 Johns Hopkins study of psychedelic mushrooms. 70% of the participants said that their trip was one of the top 5 most meaningful, spiritually significant experiences of their entire lives. And they didn't say this while they were tripping, they said it a year later. Now's the time for me to be honest and say that I am personally very skeptical of spirituality in general. But I have had these experiences on psychedelics, this kind of feeling of profound oneness. You know, for me it's like all those thoughts I was talking about before with the cookie, you know, it goes from thinking about my Grammy to thinking about baking as like
a metaphor for cosmic inflation and how the laws of physics are just baked into reality
from the Big Bang, and how all of the elements that comprise everything are like the ingredients, and they were all forged via nuclear fusion in supernovas, right? Just like my Grammy's kitchen. And if we could all just remember that like loving Grammy force of the universe and remember what that feels like, everything would be okay. And it feels really
urgently important that I tell everybody, but I can't quite
put it into words because my
brain is melting and I'm dying. Oh my god, I'm dying. But it's okay. It's all okay.
Because I will be compost.
And Grammy always uses compost.
And I'll go in the garden and I'll grow into a tomato. And then she can put me in a salad. And she'll have
to chop me up into little pieces, but it's okay.
Everything is okay because we're all just little pieces.
But why is it okay? I'm trying to get at something here because I think if you were to take psychedelics, you know, the details might be different. You might not think about your Grammy and physics and cookies, but you probably would have this specific feeling of being one with the universe. And that's a weirdly specific thing for so many people to report in so many clinical studies.
Yes, everything is one. I am one with what I am.
A 2016 LSD study showed that the only thing that all of the test subjects had in common in their trips was a feeling of ego dissolution. What I mean is the perception of the self as separate from the rest of reality got a bit blurry. They describe it in spiritual terms, but I think it's something I can fansplain scientifically, and I don't think that diminishes it.
And I can feel the air. I can see it. I can see all the molecules. I'm part of it.
Everything's alive, and it's all made from the same stuff. I never realized. In him, I ride the amber sap, oozing through miniature labyrinths. Through him, I sprawl with the swamp, sopping, steaming.
A psychedelic trip can veer quickly between feelings of euphoria and doom. And that's what happens to Abby, too. She says that she savors the smells of life, but also the smells of death. And then she starts imagining herself as a rat underground.
My enemy's blood erupts to fill my mouth with molten copper. I circle the hawk moths at their conjugation, breathless at the alien desires abstracted in their dance. There is no contradiction, only the pulse within the world, within us, within me.
Me? There isn't any me.
So if we took somebody who was experiencing ego dissolution from psychedelics and we put them in a brain scanner, what would we see? Well, there's way more traffic between the sensory cortices and the frontal parietal network. And your sensory cortices are processing your perceptions, and your frontal parietal network, that's the part of your brain that's the most active when you're being introspective, when you're thinking about yourself or your future or making decisions. That's the part of your brain that kind of goes a little quiet when you're asleep or under anesthesia. So on psychedelics, there's all this traffic between your senses and your self part, but there's a lot less traffic within the self part. What this means is that your brain starts sort of mixing signals between what it's getting from the outside and what it says about itself on the inside. So you actually experience this as reality blending together a bit. So you might look at another person and feel them to be an extension of yourself.
Where we touch, the fibers merge and intertangle. I'm no longer certain where I end, where he begins. I feel my own hand as he feels it, a warm bird caged within my strong green fingers, pulse hammering in its breast.
There was a study where they gave a battery of psychological tests to a bunch of people, and then they gave them psilocybin mushrooms, and then they gave them all those tests again later. And they found that after their trips, a lot of these people scored a lot higher on the openness scale and a lot lower on authoritarianism. They were more likely to want to try new foods, less likely to vote for sort of like tradition-focused politicians. They are more likely to call themselves part of nature. And this was 14 months after the trip was over. So this means that their experience of ego dissolution, their feeling of oneness, turned into an idea that stuck with them long after the trip was over. This feeling of being one with the universe, that's a really common idea in religion and philosophy, from Taoism to Buddhism to Greek philosophers like Plotinus or Swamp Thing comics. In writing Saga of the Swamp Thing, Alan Moore borrowed a lot from Dante's Inferno. So Abby is Swamp Thing's Beatrice, John Constantine is his Virgil, and like Dante, Swamp Thing is on this journey towards divinity. Both stories deal with the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen if God is omnipotent? For Dante, it's just about contrast. Evil exists for the glory of God because it is punished in hell in a very symmetrical way. For Swamp Thing, it's more complicated. For example, he saves this village of people from a pregnant vampire mermaid, but then afterwards he's kind of struggling with whether that is like intervening in nature, right? Like, what if Swamp Thing saved a bunny rabbit from getting eaten by a fox? That fox is evil to the bunny. But if the fox is bringing the bunny home to its puppies for food, then the fox is good, it's the mommy, right? And so Swamp Thing looks at this and is like, where is the evil in this? Swamp Thing gets recruited for this big apocalyptic battle. All the angels and demons and magic-powered superheroes have united to try to stop this impending destruction force that's coming to just annihilate their reality. Spoiler alert, it beats everybody, and nobody's left except for Swamp Thing, and he tries to just talk to it. This death force asks Swamp Thing,
What are you telling me the purpose of evil?
Swamp Thing says,
I have seen evil, its cruelty, the randomness with which it ravages innocent and guilty alike. I have not understood it.
He said he asked the previous Swamp Things, the Parliament of Trees.
They spoke of aphids eating leaves, bugs eating aphids, themselves finally devoured by the soil, feeding the foliage.
This is one of those ideas that can sound really trivial. Of course there's a circle of life. Of course we're all made of atoms. But psychedelics make these things feel urgently true. The giant hand of death reaches up, and the hand of creation reaches down, and there's this big metaphysical handshake that blows everybody's minds, and then everything's just back to the status quo. It's the characters' perspectives that have changed, not reality. This kind of status quo circularity has a little bit of an echo from the Wes Craven movie, which is just a bunch of chase scenes going in circles. But still.
Much beauty in the swamp, if you only look.
Which brings me to Swamp Thing issue 43. A dying woman takes one of Swamp Thing's tubers, and she eats it, and she tells her husband,
It's all life. It's all the same thing, an ocean, but all divided up and contained in separate bottles. David, you're beautiful.
In a 2010 NYU study, they gave psychedelic mushrooms to some terminally ill cancer patients. In an interview with The New Yorker, one of those patients described her hallucination as flying through space like she was in a video game until she hit this brick wall and she realized it was the wall of a crematorium.
The next thing I know, I'm below the ground in this gorgeous forest. There's deep woods, loamy and brown. There are roots all around me, and I'm seeing the trees growing, and I'm part of them. And it didn't feel sad or happy, just natural, contented, peaceful. I wasn't gone. I was part of the earth.
Several patients described edging up to the precipice of death and peering over across
the great plane of consciousness. It was very serene and beautiful. I felt alone, but I could reach out and touch anyone I'd ever known. When my time came, that's where my life would go once it left me, and that was okay.
Death is pretty scary. Chances are you're on the internet trying to just not think about your own mortality. You know, I was doing the same thing and I came across this metaphor with Legos. The idea was that if you built a robot out of Legos, took it apart, used the Legos to build a spaceship, what happened to the robot? I think with psychedelics, they let us feel ourselves to be our Legos, not the robot. And if you can hang on to that feeling after the trip is over, it really does change the way you look at reality. And I think this is something that people miss in modern mindfulness stuff. Like, I really don't begrudge anybody who uses meditation to deal with anxiety or focus or anything like that. It's great. But the original impetus for meditation in Buddhism is to attain enlightenment, perspective on yourself as a temporary assembly of building blocks. And you might say to me, Fansplainer, no, you're wrong. I am more than just the sum of my pieces. I have a personal history, a personal way of seeing things. That's the real me. To which I would say, awesome. Now we're talking about the self and consciousness. And that brings me to my favorite Swamp Thing superpower. He can project his consciousness and regrow his body somewhere else. Could that ever be possible in real life for us? That's the topic of our next episode. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave me a thumbs up if you like this video, or a thumbs down. I'm going to try to be really enlightened about it. I hope we can have a trippy conversation in the comment section. If you want to see my sources or some reading recommendations, visit the description. And if you want to help me stay on this YouTube plane of existence a little longer, visit my Patreon. And if you want more comics in context, subscribe to me!
Shoo!